Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Men, the Director of Equipping Church Leaders East Africa, or ECLEA, and this is the first of a series of video lectures on the ECLEA book on the book of Revelation. Now, the book of Revelation is, I think, one of the most important, but also one of the most misunderstood, and also most abused books in the entire Bible. And much nonsense has been written about the book of Revelation. And so I hope in these lectures we can dispel some of the misinformation that people have about the book of Revelation, and also help us to see how important this book really is and what it is really saying to us. So we'll be going through the ECLEA book on Revelation. We'll be looking first at the genre, different interpretive approaches to the book of Revelation, the situation of the church in the late first century when the book was written. We'll be looking at the purposes and themes of Revelation, the structure of the book, and we'll be spending some time looking at the church in the book of Revelation, because many people think that the church is not present in the book of Revelation. In fact, it's present throughout the book, albeit in symbolic form. Then we'll look at we'll have an overview of the major ideas and sections of the book, and then we'll talk about the implications of the book of Revelation. Now, before beginning, I should also point out that over the course of 2 or 3 years, I preached a series of 16 sermons going throughout the book of Revelation, hitting most of the major passages. Those sermons are located on the sermons page of the ECLEA website. The ECLEA website is www.eclea.net. And if you go to the sermons page, you'll be able to find those 16 sermons. Both the audio and the written sermons are on the sermons page. And I would suggest that you either listen to those or read those for a couple of reasons. Number one, as I say, I went through preached through the entire book of Revelation, and those sermons will help to augment what we will be saying in these video lectures. They'll be expounding particular passages of the book of Revelation, so I think they will be a good adjunct to these lectures. And secondly, they will help, since they were sermons, they'll help you to see the difference between a sermon and a lecture. There are many similarities, of course, but there are also some differences. And so I would invite you to listen or read those 16 sermons on the book of Revelation. But for our purposes now, let's begin by taking a look at the genre of the book of Revelation. Now, what is genre? Genre is simply a fancy word that means the type of writing. And the Bible is filled with different genres. There's epistles, there's prophecy, there's narrative history, there's poetry, there are legal texts. There's all kinds of different genres. And it's important when you're reading a book to know what genre it is, because, I mean, for example, some people say you must take everything literally unless forced not to do so. Well, that's not true. It depends upon the genre. If you're reading poetry, the proper way to interpret and understand poetry is to read it poetically. If you're looking at metaphor, the proper way to understand and interpret metaphor is metaphorically, not literally. If you're reading symbols, the proper way to interpret and understand symbols is symbolically, not literally. So you need to know the genre if you're going to understand what a particular book is saying. For example, somewhere in the Bible it talks about the trees clapping their hands. Now, we obviously understand we don't take that literally because trees don't have hands, but that is a poetic way of making a particular point. So, what's the genre of the book of Revelation? Well, most all scholars recognize that the book of Revelation actually consists of three genres. It is an epistle, it is a prophecy, and it is also a particular kind of prophecy called apocalyptic. Now, we know that the book of Revelation is an epistle because right at the beginning it begins with a typical prescript of an epistle. Now, in the first century, writers who were writing a letter or an epistle to somebody typically began by saying who they are, the name of the author first. Then the epistle was written. The next thing would be who the author was writing to, and then some words of greeting. So we see that beginning in chapter 1, verse 4, where he says, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace from him who is, and who was, and who is to come, and from the 7 spirits who are before the throne, and from Jesus Christ, the faithful witness, the firstborn of the dead, and the ruler of the kings of the earth. Now, so that's telling us that, that's a typical prescript or beginning of an epistle, which is telling us that the book of Revelation is an epistle. He begins by saying, John, the author, who it's to, the recipients, the 7 churches that are in Asia. And by the way, when the Bible refers to Asia, it's not talking about India or China or Japan or Korea. No, Asia was a province of the Roman Empire in what is today the western half of modern-day Turkey. So he's writing to specific churches in the province of Asia, and then he gave the words of greeting, grace to you and peace. Now, why is it important to know that the book of Revelation is an epistle? It's important because a lot of people think that the book of Revelation is like a secret code that only applies to events far in the future, just before Jesus comes again. Well, that's not true, because all epistles were designed to be understood by their recipients, by the first century recipients. And therefore, the fact that this is an epistle tells us that the book of Revelation was written to be relevant and understandable to the people in the first century. But the book of Revelation also is a prophecy. Now, both at the beginning of the book, in chapter 1, verse 3, it's specifically called a prophecy. He says, Blessed is he who reads and those who hear the words of the prophecy. And at the end of the book, in Revelation 22, verse 7, he likewise says, this is Jesus speaking, Behold, I am coming quickly. Blessed is he who heeds the words of the prophecy of this book. So the book of Revelation is a prophecy, and there are a number of passages throughout the book that talk about prophets and prophesying. Now, we need to understand something about biblical prophecy. And by the way, we talk more about this in our book on biblical interpretation, and also in our book on biblical eschatology. But essentially, again, many people think that prophecy is simply predicting the future, and that's not correct. Yes, there is a predictive element in prophecy, but the prophets typically spoke what are called oracles of judgment and oracles of salvation. In other words, the prophets were interested in the present, and particularly in changing people's behavior. And so essentially, the role of the prophets was to call people back to faithfulness. And they would do this. An oracle of judgment essentially is saying, you people are going off track. You're being unfaithful to the Lord. And if you don't change, God is going to bring judgment. But, oracle of salvation, if you do change, if you repent, then God will bless you. Or will save you. Now, that is true, and the Apostle John, writing the book of Revelation, follows in the long line of biblical prophets, and as we will see as we go through this book, essentially one of the important things that this book is doing is advising us how God is acting in the world, so that we will remain faithful. It is a call to remain faithful despite tough times. And so the entire book is focusing on the present. As we will see, the book is designed to be relevant from the time John wrote it in the first century all the way up until Jesus comes again, whenever that may be. And so, because it was relevant back in the first century, and it is just as relevant today, it is designed to affect our behavior, and it is a call for us to remain faithful. And so, as with all biblical prophecies, the prophetic element in the book of Revelation, it shows us God's nature and his purposes in the present circumstances of the church, and it shows us how God's ultimate purpose relates to the present circumstance of the church and what the people are to do. But I said that the book of Revelation also consists of a third genre called apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic is actually a particular kind of prophecy. It is a form of prophecy that is based on symbols. And the writers of apocalyptic, and by the way, the genre of apocalyptic flourished both in Jewish and in Christian circles from about 250 BC to approximately 250 AD, and then it kind of faded out. And so one reason that the book of Revelation is so mystifying to so many people is that it is largely a book of apocalyptic. The writers who wrote apocalyptic, they looked for the radical intervention of God in the world, and apocalyptic was all based on visions and symbols. And we know that this book is apocalyptic because the essence of the entire book is symbolic. In fact, the Revelation as a whole, it begins in Revelation 1 verse 1 by saying, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show to his bondservants the things which must soon take place. That, the word in verse 1, revelation, it uses the word semino, which means communicate by symbols. And the word show, again, it shows that this is a book based upon symbols. And therefore, when we have symbols, we need to look at it symbolically. We don't take symbols literally. Symbols are visionary statements that are explaining deeper spiritual truths. Now, the sources of John's symbolism primarily come from the Old Testament and from the Greco-Roman culture in which he lived. And so the symbols that John uses in Revelation would have been very common and understood by his original readers because, certainly the Jews were steeped in the Old Testament, and they were all living in the Greco-Roman world. And so one reason why modern readers have difficulty with the book of Revelation is that we are not familiar with the symbols and or with the culture that John was writing from. And so now symbols are not meant to be pictures of objective facts or taken literally. Rather, they are representations of spiritual realities. And that's why oftentimes symbols are phrased in sort of cautious or ambiguous language. For example, in the book of Ezekiel 1 verse 26, Ezekiel says, there was something resembling a throne, like lapis lazuli in appearance. And in Revelation 15 verse 2, John says, I saw something like a sea of glass mixed with fire. So this tells us that these are symbols. They're not to be taken literally, so we need, and we will be discussing, what are these symbols getting at? What is the big point he's trying to make? And one thing about symbols is that oftentimes multiple different symbols can be used for the exact same thing. For example, at one point in Revelation 4, heaven is pictured as a throne room, but in Revelation 6, heaven is pictured as a temple. Likewise, in Revelation 5, Jesus is portrayed both as a lion and as a lamb. It's not that there are two different entities, it's that the different symbols are bringing out different aspects of that which is being symbolized. And at the end of the book, John sees a woman who is a harlot. In Revelation 17, it talks about the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth, and is called Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots. So the same entity, it's not talking about an individual city, it's talking about something, a worldwide socioeconomic and religious culture or civilization, but it's portrayed as a city and as a woman. And so we see the fluidity of these symbols. Now, a few guidelines for interpreting symbolic language. First, some symbols are interpreted in the book of Revelation itself. For example, in chapter 1, it talks about John sees someone holding 7 stars in his hand. And now, later on, he says, the 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. He also sees 7 lampstands. In chapter 1, verse 20, he says the 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. And so later on in chapter 5, he talks about bowls of incense. He describes that in verse 8 as they are the prayers of the saints. There's a reference later on in chapter 12 to the great dragon. But that is specifically defined as Satan himself. In chapter 19, the saints wear fine linen, bright and clean. That's defined as the righteous acts of the saints. Now, other symbols, they show continuity with other books in the Old Testament and the New Testament. Because, as I mentioned, John draws upon Old Testament symbols and writings in the New Testament, but he often changes these or kind of redefines them or fleshes out their meaning. For example, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the beasts in Revelation 13. Now, the beasts are drawn from the book of Daniel. And one important thing we need to understand is when the Bible talks about beasts, a lot of people think it talks about some end-time individual, but every time the Bible talks about beasts, it actually is talking about empires that may have lasted thousands of years. In Daniel, it talks about these 4 beasts. Well, John in Revelation draws on that symbolism, but does not talk about 4, but he talks about the beast from the sea and the beast from the earth. And what John does with a lot of these symbols is he universalizes them. And so, for example, I just mentioned in talking about Babylon the Great. Yes, there was a real historical Babylon, but now John is using Babylon as a symbol, not of the individual city of Babylon, but as talking about how it reigned over the kings of the entire earth. So what John does is take his symbols and universalizes them, because he is talking about, throughout this book of Revelation, he's talking about forces and factors, influences that affect everybody. In other words, he's going to the root and heart of the matter. And so, now, symbols that he does not explicitly define. As I mentioned, he defines a number of the symbols, but he doesn't define them all. And so, to understand what's going on, they need to be interpreted according to the context of the book and the major idea that John is conveying. And again, we need to look at the general purpose of prophetic symbolism. He is using symbols primarily to turn the reader of the book away from what God is going to do towards the theological meaning of what he is going to do. And so that, throughout the book, we see pictures of locust plagues, meteor showers, volcanoes, storms, and so on. Some of these may happen literally, but many will not. The important thing is to know that what he is calling the church to is remain faithful despite hard times which are going to come upon the church. He's drawing a theological connection. In other words, he talks about the Battle of Harmageddon. Now, that's based upon two Greek words. Har means mountain, and Mageddon refers to Megiddo. It's referring to the mountain of Megiddo. You need to understand, there is no literal mountain of Megiddo. There was a plain of Megiddo, and that plain was the site of two famous battles where the Canaanites were slaughtered by Barak, and that's celebrated in the Song of Deborah in Judges 5. And that's also where King Josiah fell. Now, I think scholars suggest that John uses the phrase Harmageddon not to refer to a physical final battle on a particular non-existent mountain or plain, but he's drawing a theological connection to show us what will happen to all of Christ's enemies when Christ comes again. And so what John is doing here is calling the church to faithfulness. He's comforting his readers because God knows the end from the beginning, and he is challenging us to endurance. Now, two other things I'll mention, and then we'll close this lecture. In looking at the non-literal use of language and symbols in Revelation, we need to understand a lot of numbers are used in the book of Revelation. Now, numbers typically in apocalyptic literature are symbols of ideas. And so there are multiple numbers in Revelation, but most all of them are drawn or derived from the numbers 4, 7, 10, and 12. While some of them may be literal, they're all symbolic. And so, for example, in Revelation 1, it describes Christ. In verses 13 and 14, it says, he is seen as one like a son of man. His eyes were like flames of fire. Well, now a man typically has two eyes. Now, in chapter 5, Christ appears as a lamb, standing as if slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes. Now, 7 typically is a number of fullness or completion, which suggests that, lambs don't have 7 eyes. This is a symbolic thing showing that he has fullness of vision. He's omniscient. And 7 horns. Horn is a symbol of power or strength. 7 horns is indicating that Jesus has all the power and authority in the entire universe. Now, time references. Again, these are symbolic. In Revelation 17, it talks about the reign of 10 kings lasted 1 hour. Obviously not a literal time period. It talks about 10 days of tribulation in Revelation 2. Again, clearly not meant literally. John is making theological connections. And so in the middle of the book, a number of times we see a symbolic time period of 3.5 years. It's referred to either as 42 months or 1,260 days or times and half a time. Again, these time periods are figurative, not literal. Now, because Jesus has told us very clearly at the end of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 and 25 that no one knows when Jesus is coming again. If we knew that this was a literal 3.5 years, we could predict when Jesus is coming again. Now, these time periods were actually derived from history. Again, kind of like Babylon. Babylon was a true historical city. It's in the Bible. But John takes that and universalizes Babylon the Great to show the great anti-Christian world, kingdom, economic system, theological system, culture. He does the same thing with time, times, and half a time, or 3.5 years. That time comes from the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, who was was in charge of the Jews between the completion of the Old Testament and the New. He defiled the temple, which led to what's called the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabees threw off Antiochus, and the war, which lasted from about 171 to 167, lasted about 3.5 years. And during the intertestamental period between the Old and the New Testaments, that 3.5 year period again became generalized in Jewish thought and in Jewish writing to represent a general time of trial or test for believers before their final redemption. And that's the way John is using this period now. He's saying we are in, and the time and a half a times is not, again, a literal 3.5 year period. It's referring to the time between, essentially, Christ's first coming and his second coming. We are in this time of trial now. And we are facing all kinds of challenges, but we are called to remain faithful because Christ is going to redeem and save us when he comes again. And so these themes of suffering and safety, trial and testimony, alienation and nourishment are all bound up in these descriptions of the time of testing of the church. And these descriptions also demonstrate God's sovereignty over the church, God's sovereignty over Satan, his sovereignty over suffering and evil, and the fact that he has a redemptive plan and he is bringing it about. And our response to that these are the major themes, and we'll talk more about this in the next lecture, of the book of Revelation. But the book of Revelation was relevant in the first century. It has been relevant throughout history. It is relevant today, and it will continue to be relevant until Jesus comes again, because the book of Revelation is essentially talking about God's plan for the world between Christ's first coming and his second coming. We are a part of this. We will face difficult times, we will face struggles, but we are called to remain faithful. That is essentially the message of the book of Revelation, and we will flesh this out further in the next lecture.